like to call to order the workshop for the Vallecitos Water District, and let me lead the pledge this time. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, Diane.
Director Ellsworth.
Here.
Director Evans will be nominated absent. Director Martin.
Present.
Director Schneider.
Here.
Director Hand.
Here. Entertain a motion to,
So moved. Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
I see no public comments, so let's move right along into item number 1.
All right, good afternoon, President Hernandez, members of the board. So we're here today to have a workshop about PERS costs. So we talked about it at the board meeting last Wednesday, kind of teed it up, referencing that we'd be having this workshop today where we hope to get into the meat of the issue. So the agenda today, we'll talk a little bit about the purpose, go a little over what we said, what we talked about on May 16th, last week's board meeting. We'll talk about the legal considerations, and Mr. Gilpin will be leading us through that. Talk about some of the actions that have been taken to address PERS costs. We'll talk about the components of the PERS costs. And the most important bullet is the next to the last one, which is the options to address the PERS costs. And then we'll give a little insight as to what those options would mean on Vallecitos customers. And we'll only be looking at a single-family residential customer, just to put it in that context. And if the board wants us to go deeper and look at different customer classes, we can certainly do that. So the purpose of today is to share more information with the board regarding the PERS costs. We want to address any board questions and concerns that you may have. Hopefully the board will identify the options that they want us to consider further, because the options are virtually limitless, so we need to kind of narrow down the scope so we can go a little bit deeper and then provide staff with any additional direction. So basically we want to take the PERS issues and add a little perspective to it. So bear with me on this.
You
Yes.
and Wes have been talking.
No, this was on my own. He inspires me.
Oh,
So.
There weren't any pictures like Wes's.
No, nothing, I haven't gotten that fancy. So last week's meeting, we talked about the funding sources. If you remember, PERS is this agency that pays this money to retirees, and it takes in money from the employees, the employers, and from investment earnings. We talked about unfunded accrued liability. If you remember on the timeline, those are the past due costs. That's how much short we are of the money that we should already have in the bank to pay for time spent either by retirees or those that are current service credit for those already working. We talked a little bit about normal costs, the district normal cost and the employee's normal cost. We talked about the district's current liability, the number, it's about $17.2 million according to the 2016 actuarial report. And a question was raised about the EWA liability. Vallecitos is a member agency of Encina Wastewater Authority. They're going through the same process we are. Our share of EWA's, I think they're about $14 to $16 million liability. Our share is about $3.2 million. You're not going to hear a lot about that today because EWA has not yet determined, along with its member agencies, how they're going to address their liability. But the numbers I present today are going to be focused on the classic employees in PERS and will specifically not include EWA costs. So, and we can address those at a later date. According to the EWA general manager, they're waiting until they get the 2017 actuarial report, which will probably be in the August to October timeframe, to make a decision and have their conversation go forward. So with that, I'm going to ask Mr. Gilpin to address the legal considerations. Jim, I don't know if you want to speak from here. Or
Either way.
we can advance it for you, or we can, does this not work? Yeah. Let me just hit the down arrow.
Down arrow.
It's hard to see.
Okay, thanks. So, given the discussions from last week and then with staff and the general manager, there were a couple of several legal considerations that I thought would be important to discuss with you going into the PERS workshop. I've outlined the four of them that we'll cover. One is what's been known as the California rule, where that stands, et cetera. PERS, the voluntary termination option under PERS and what that would mean. Alternative plans, defined benefit plans, what are the possibilities for those? Limits on employee contributions, and then the concept of cost sharing, which would mean having employees pay portions of the district's share of the PERS contributions and the limitations on those. The first is the California rule, and if you've read a lot of the press, you see this gets a lot of the blame for where we currently are. It stems from a 1955 court ruling in which the court essentially defined public benefits as sacrosanct, and that they can't be amended or changed without some offsetting benefit. That led to, I think in 2011, Jerry Brown doing some PERS reform, and then two subsequent cases which followed up on what were viewed as cuttings of the pensions. The first action was the Marin County Employees Retirement Association filed an action, and in that case, it's a Court of Appeal decision. It upheld the PEPRA provisions prohibiting pension spiking, which was one of the things identified by the governor as a problem. Another case was the CAL FIRE local case, and in that, it again is a California Court of Appeal decision which upheld a PEPRA provision that eliminated airtime. Airtime is where people were buying basically future benefits into their PERS packages. Both of those cases are up at this California Supreme Court under review. There's a lot of speculation as to what could happen. One, I don't think they will change the retro benefits. You're not going to be allowed to go back and amend benefits that have already been accrued and earned by people. The question is whether they're going to allow more latitude to entities in terms of go-forward benefits. I guess.
Would you
President.
define spiking a little more clearly as well as airtime?
Well, spiking involved situations, at least in the Marin case, where employees were taking large amounts of overtime in years preceding the retirement so that they would spike their benefits that were paid once they retired. Essentially, the spiking schemes were ways where people would enhance their future benefits by taking advantage of current things like vacation pay, etc.
Yes.
Vacation pay, sick pay, can you spike with that?
I don't know the specific circumstances in which you can spike, Director Martin. It's just a situation where people enhance their future benefits through use of their defined pension plan issues that had accrued. So, and again, both.
Rondi knows the answer.
I'm sorry?
Rondi knows the answer.
Rondi knows the answer.
Oh, here we go.
Come up here, Rondi.
I think you're referring to like cash out,
Mhm.
vacation pay or sick pay. No, it wouldn't be added to someone's base pay in order to bump up their retirement benefit.
Okay, so that's already in place.
But the classic, as I remember, some group of employees working extra overtime in order to increase their annual amount.
Right.
And which is, I guess that is spiking.
Yes, it was overtime, it was bonuses
Mhm.
and premiums and anything that they could use to bump up their pay in that last year that would drive up their retirement
Mhm.
benefit.
Okay.
They were raising their salary pay
Yeah.
by basically foregoing certain benefits that they would have been entitled to otherwise.
Mhm.
So basically sliding the benefits from
When did that stop from happening?
With PEPRA.
PEPRA.
the
With
Pension-
PEPRA.
Pension Reform Act,
which was 2011, right?
yes.
Okay.
So before 2011, that was
It was
happening.
happening.
Happened
Mhm.
here, I'm assuming.
It's possible, but I don't have any specifics off the top of my head.
Okay.
But if it was allowed, it's possible.
Yeah.
I know that here, our don't get premiums that maybe employees at other agencies get. So we don't have anything that's special comp that's reported to PERS as extra that our classic employees would be entitled to that the Pepper employees wouldn't be, if that makes sense. Because some of
Yeah.
those things impacted the Pepper employees versus the classic, and none of that happens here. We don't have anything special like that.
Thank you. That was the real question, so thank you.
Okay.
So the two cases deal with the governor eliminating those loopholes, and the Court of Appeals have upheld them. They're in front of the Supreme Court, which will be issuing a ruling relative to those.
Jim, could you address airtime? I think Director Hernandez asked about airtime as well.
Airtime was where the employee is paying to purchase future benefits. So you're essentially like an annuity, buying it to up the PERS benefits in the future.
And by buying a future benefit, like sick pay or vacation pay?
No, it was years of service essentially is what you were purchasing.
Oh,
You could,
because I know you can go backwards, you know, if you're at here and you're in the military, you can add that back in.
You have to pay a certain amount of money to get credit for years you've already served.
Yeah.
Qualifying.
So you'd buy from.
You
buy
can-
from
you
like
can do the
20
same thing
to 25, so you're qualified.
I see, so you
Yeah.
could do the same thing ahead.
the classic employees used to allow purchases of from 1 to up to 5 years of service credit.
Uh-huh.
But not any longer.
Not any longer
Not
under
with Pepper.
Okay,
Pepper
very
did
good.
away with
All
it.
right, thank you
And what
very
about
much.
classic employees that are still around?
You can no longer make a
Even the
By
purchase.
airtime period.
I don't think you can. right?
No, you can't.
You can't do airtime, but you can do other things, like if you started off as a part-time employee and you weren't in PERS, but then later on at that same employer, you were eligible for PERS, you can buy that time,
Buy that.
so.
In the
it has-
rear,
In arrears.
Yeah.
yeah.
There has to be, they have certain criteria that you have to meet, but airtime is basically saying anyone can do it. There's no criteria, anyone can do it, bring us your money and you can do it. So that went away.
The circumstance you just brought up, do we have anyone in that class right now that's doing that?
I imagine so.
They started as part-time without PERS?
Oh, any part-timers? No. I don't think so. But military time, I know in the past that's happened, we've had people buy up to X number of years based on their military service, and that's still allowed.
And, well, just out of curiosity, okay, so that's still allowed, so someone put in 8 years and then we hired them. Okay, my question is financially, who ends up paying for that? Someone ends up paying for that. Is it Vallecitos? Is it the military?
It's the employee. PERS does basically an analysis to determine how much it will cost that employee to pay for those years of service, and
Okay.
they develop a payment plan. And it's not supposed to impact the employer. Not supposed to impact the employer.
Okay, so, and thank you, not supposed to, but it can.
I suppose it's possible.
I mean, the situation we're looking at now is, we haven't paid enough into it, so I would have to assume that someone that bought airtime hadn't paid enough into it either.
Right?
That'd just be an assumption.
Because it was a point in time estimate from PERS that said this is how much it will cost based on a number of assumptions. And if something changed, you know, they could have either paid less than what was needed or more.
So that unfunded liability would go to us, not to that person, doesn't go after that person.
Correct.
They go after us.
Thank you.
The next question I was asked to discuss is whether you could voluntarily terminate your relationship with PERS. Under the law, it is possible, but, there's a huge but. You would be required to pay what is your current existing obligations under PERS. And in your instance, you get a report, which is the 2016 dollars. I think your accrued liability, depending on the percentage you use, is somewhere between $62 million and $80 million. They give you a hypothetical payout, which is in excess of $100 million. Or if an agency goes down this route, what it does is adopt a resolution of intent to terminate. You have to do it there's a 1-year period that you adopt the notice, and then a year later you terminate. During that year period, PERS steps in and helps you calculate what your exit liability is going to be, and then you make a decision that you're either going to go forward with it or not. Again, it's possible, but it's really expensive and doesn't really get you anywhere because you still got that accrued liability issue.
That's good. Yeah,
Okay.
our number right now is about, if we want to get out of PERS, it would cost us about $80 million.
How much?
80
million.
And that number, again, is based on their 2016 calculations, so depending on what's happened since then, it's probably higher.
My question is, I mean, that sounds like a ridiculous way to go, but if you were to pay them $80 million, they pay the future benefits of all those people?
No, you would roll in and define your future benefits. They basically stop being the fiduciary for operating the fund.
So they let you out, and you create another entity, whatever
Yeah,
that may be, but you'd have to pay into it to keep your employees whole as to where they were. That's ridiculous.
You get to take your baggage with you,
Wow.
so. There are defined benefit packages that are available. There is a 557B plan, which is, for anyone private, it's simply like a 401K. There are employer and employee contributions. Again, these two plans that I'm talking about could be done in addition to PERS, but they can't be done as a quote alternative to PERS without terminating PERS. We have clients who have adopted the 457 plans on top of PERS to allow their employees another investment strategy, basically allowing them to invest their own dollars tax-free. There's limitations. It's 18, I think it's 18.5 this year on the employee contribution side. The other one is the 401A, which is a defined contribution plan, which involves really investments from the employer side. You can have employees contributions with that as well. But again, both those vehicles could be adopted as an add-on if you wanted to, but without terminating PERS, they really don't provide, they do not provide an alternative to it. The employee contributions, questions have come up, what are the limits on the amount of employee contributions? The government code sets forth limits. The shorthand of this is your employee limits are currently at 8%, which is the limit of required contributions for an employee. So you can't require the employees to contribute more than 8% without going into negotiations with them. And the way the law is written, you cannot impose the requirement on them. So if they don't agree to it, you can't impose it. So you've got limits on the 8% as well. Director Martin?
Is that federal law or California law?
California law.
Are other states different?
I'm sure they are. I don't know the exact differences because they're all different in terms of their pensions. I think there's 12 states that follow the California rule, so they're, and of course, across the nation, there's been pension reform, and so they're all different.
Thank you.
The other issue I mentioned to you was the cost sharing, which is where employers have asked the employees to pick up a share of the employer's side of the contribution. You have the same issue here. You can't impose that on your employees. They would have to agree to it through through a collective bargaining agreement with the labor groups. So those are the statutory limitations on your employer-employee contribution limits.
Great. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you,
Just
Jim.
ask a question, Jim?
Yes.
Now, we do have a 457, don't we? In our
Yeah,
plan?
we do.
We do, okay.
And the employer does match up to $1,000
Yeah.
if the employee's been employed for at least a year.
Right, okay.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the actions that have been taken already to address the PERS costs, not just what we're talking about today, but things that have already been done, basically by 3 groups. I may have touched a little bit on this on Wednesday, but we'll go over it again. So at the state level, led by the governor back in 2011, PEPRA, the Public Employees Pension Reform Act, came into place. And I list a lot of the benefits of that. As it affects all new hires after 2013. So it was enacted in 2011, but there's a period of phasing it in. It reduced the benefit formula and increased the retirement age for all new employees, all new hires. So they have what's called a 2% at 62 plan. So if you retire at age 62, you get 2% of your highest year's salary in perpetuity.
What was it prior to that?
Well, currently, our classic employees are at 3 at 60, so we get 3%. If you retire at age 60, you get 3% of your salary for every year you've served here. It prohibits new tiers and formulas for new employees, so you can't undo PEPRA. You can't say, okay, next year I'm going to increase or decrease the benefit formulas. It places a cap on pensionable compensation. That's what Mr. Gilpin talked a little bit, as well as spiking, so it eliminated those spiking practices. And it provided for an equal sharing of normal costs for new employees. So we call them PEPRA employees, the new employees that came in under PEPRA after 2013. They share with the district equally, 50-50 in their going forward normal costs. So the state wasn't the only group that took action. PERS took action, and they did several things. One is they lowered the discount rate. I'm sorry.
Can I just go back to that? What does normal costs, equal sharing of normal costs, what does that?
So remember, the unfunded accrued liability was the cost in the past, and the normal costs are the costs going forward. So
Okay.
a normal cost is how much should I be putting aside this year to cover this year's
I got it.
impacts.
Didn't ring bells. Thank
Good.
you.
All right. So PERS took several actions. They lowered the discount rate. And remember, the discount rate is the amount that they assume that their investment portfolio is going to make on the market. So currently it's at 7.5%. They're lowering it to 7% over a 3-year period. They also shortened the amortization schedule. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a few slides, but originally it was at 30 years. They wanted that unfunded accrued liability to be paid over. Now they've shortened that to 20 years. So the net effect of that is it saves money in the long run, but it's sometimes more painful for the period of time. You're paying more in the years that you pay than you would otherwise. And the last bullet under PERS is they revised their strategic asset allocation, which basically means they're changing how they're investing. So they're trying to better match the interest rate that they think they're going to get, or investment rate that they're going to get on their funds. So the Water District also did some of its own reforms. So we eliminated what we call EPMC, the Employer Paid Member Contribution. So that 8% share, instead of the employee paying it, the employer had been paying for it. We'll talk about that a little bit more too. And when we phased in that EPMC reduction, we offered lump sum one-time payments as opposed to increasing salaries to offset it. Because it doesn't do you much good to decrease the percentage but increase their salary, and you kind of end up right where you were. So let's talk a little bit about the employee cost, or the employee normal cost. It's calculated by multiplying the employee cost percentage by the payroll amount, so how much that person makes. So right now, we're heading towards a maximum rate of 8%. So a good example is if an employee made $50,000 per year and the employee cost share was 8%, that employee would be responsible for $4,000. He'd have to take $4,000 of his 50 and put it into PERS to cover his share or her share of the normal cost. The district has historically provided the EPMC, but the bottom of the slide shows how we're phasing out. So the employee share prior to fiscal year 13-14, the employee didn't pick up anything. Starting in 13-14 through 15-16, so those 3 years, the employee was picking up 4 of the 8%. Last year, they added 1 more percent, so they were picking up 5%. The year we're in now, the employees pick up 6%. Starting July 1, the employee is picking up the last 2%. So starting next fiscal year, July 1 of this calendar year, the employee will be at the full 8% cost share. So the next is the district normal cost. How much should the district be putting aside every year for the upcoming year of service for each employee? And their calculation is pretty similar. They take the district normal cost share percentage and multiply that by payroll. The normal cost percentage is tied to the PERS discount rate. So as PERS lowered the discount rate, it actually increases the normal cost percentage. If you remember back last Wednesday, those three pieces that fed into the PERS machine, there's the employee, the employer, and the investment earnings. If you decrease the investment earnings by decreasing the discount rate, something else has to increase to offset it. So that's what you see here. As the discount rate goes down, the normal cost percentage goes up. In the bottom of the slide here, we show currently the employer normal cost percentage is 12.698%, and it's increasing to 15.2% in fiscal year 2021 and thereafter. So that's ramping up too. So the unfunded accrued liability, that's kind of the third piece of the puzzle here. Overall, the PERS program is funded at about 68%. So the total money they should have, they have about 68% of that. Vallecitos, according to the last actuarial report, which is done in 2016, we are at 74.4%. So we're actually well ahead, not only of PERS as a whole, but of most other agencies. There's not many agencies that have a higher funded ratio than Vallecitos does, so we're in a good position. And our unfunded accrued liability, which is basically the amount that we'd have to pay to them to get to 100% funded, as of 2016 actuarial report was $17.2 million. So a while ago, probably a couple of years ago, PERS said, hey, we have to do something here. Our funded ratio is too small, it's too low, we need to get closer to fully funded. So they embarked on this plan to get us collectively, all the individual agencies and PERS as a whole, to get them fully funded. And they came up with a 30-year repayment plan. So for each agency, and again, there's over 1,000 agencies in PERS, they came up with a repayment schedule based on that agency's unfunded accrued liability and the discount rate that they have set. So the discount rates are shown here, starting at 7.5%, going down to 7% in year 2021 and beyond. I think it was February of this year, PERS realized that a 30-year amortization is too long, so they cut it down to 20 years. Originally, they said an agency could pick from a 30-year, a 20-year, or a 15-year amortization. They've now taken the 30-year amortization off the table. We're going to show you a chart that shows what that 30-year was, just to put it in perspective, but keep in mind that that's not an available option at this point in time. So this is where we're getting into the actual options, and this is where we really need to focus, because we're going to be asking you for direction on what we should be moving forward with as we go forward. So remember, the baseline payment is the 20-year payment. In the slides that follow this, you're going to see a lot of numbers and graphs and charts, but this is just kind of setting the stage, and then Mike's actually going to come up here and walk you through the charts. So the baseline option is 20 years, or the baseline payment is 20 years. Option one, and we want to offer for the board's consideration, is what if you wanted to pay that off over 15 years? Just like your house mortgage, if you wanted to take a 15-year mortgage instead of a 30-year mortgage, you can do that. You'll save a lot of money, but you're going to pay a lot more in the years that you pay. Option two, you can make supplemental payments. And by that I mean you'd have to pay the minimum payment, the 20-year schedule that PERS is providing, but you can make payments on top of that. Again, similar to your home mortgage, if you wanted to pay the minimum amount, that's fine, but you can pay supplemental payments and you can reduce the overall amount. We have three sub-options on that. One is you can make an additional fixed amount per year. You're going to see an example in here where we say, what if we paid $1 million over and above what the 20-year payment is per year? So you'll see some numbers on that. Option 2B, what if you did a specified amount of a year-end surplus? So for example, the board could adopt a policy that says 50% of whatever their surplus is at the end of the year will put towards the PERS payment. That's an example. Or you can say, if we save up to $1 million, we'll put $500,000 towards PERS. We couldn't analyze that because we don't know what that will be. We don't have hard numbers to put there, but it's an option that the board consider. Many agencies do that. Water districts that I know do that. They say at the end of the year, we look at how we did at the end of the year, and we put a portion of that towards our PERS liability. Option 2C, you can commit one-time funds. So if the district came into money somehow, you can say all those funds that we weren't counting on anyway are going to go to reduce our single highest percent debt that we have, which is our PERS obligation. A good example may be the Diamond Environmental Services case that's pending. If we were to come into $800,000 to $900,000, that money could be used for any purpose, and that may be a point to do, a place to put it. Again, we couldn't analyze that because we don't know how much that may be in any given year. Option 3 is to pay off the unfunded accrued liability using borrowed money. And we looked at two alternatives with a few variations on the second one. So option 3A is to just go out and borrow money. You don't borrow money really just to pay off the UAL. You borrow money to increase your reserves to pay for other things, replacement things, but you have access to more money. So that debt would be for a specific term and a specific percent. And we have an example for you that you'll see in just a few minutes. Option 3B is to borrow money from yourself. Take money out of the reserves, pay down the UAL, and then develop a repayment plan so that over a fixed period of time, you repay the reserve account. Again, you'd have a fixed term and a fixed percentage rate. And the recommendation would be the fixed percentages rate is what that money would have otherwise been earning if you had left it in the reserve account. You'd probably take an average and have a fixed amount that represents what you think it would get over the term. And then option 4 is simply a combination of any of those up above. We can probably pick and choose those things. And I don't recommend that. I think we can pick one of the options above and move forward. So that's kind of just in general what we're talking about. So I'm going to ask Mike to come up now, and he's going to walk you through some specifics. A lot of the information you see is going to be derived from the most recent actuarial report in 2016. That kind of defines the baseline 30-year, and then going forward from there, we did some of our own calcs, and we relied on information from PERS. So with that, Mike.
Quick question. Quick question is just, is Mike gonna do the ta-da moment? Because all this information is great, but if we saw numbers as to what it's gonna cost to amortize over 30 years with no benefit.
You will see more numbers than you want
All right.
to see, and I don't know which ta-da moment you're talking about, but Mike's going to present some costs of what it takes to retire the UAL payment. I'm going to then come up and talk about where that money comes from. How do we, because we don't have a printing press at Vallecitos. We don't make money. So we have to incorporate it into rates, and it ultimately comes from the customers. So at the end of the presentation, I'm going to explain what those costs would mean to a typical single-family customer.
Thank you, General Manager Broom. Mr. President, Board. Numbers, you want numbers? I don't have them. No.
You're the man.
Okay. So let's get into it. So General Manager Perone was talking about how PERS was offering the 30-year payment on your UAL. So here is the graph of what that would look like. So the payments with the 30-year, with the issue with that was that the payments were irregular every year. It's not like your home mortgage where you're paying $3,000 a month or $2,500 a month. The payments were on an accelerated schedule, and then they went down in the 1 year really fast and then leveled off at the end. So when PERS did their rate analysis and changed their discount rate from the 7.5 now down to what's going to be the 7%, they said, okay, well, let's not take that one off the table. Let's do a 20-year amortization schedule. It's more like a home mortgage where it is a set amount every year. So what that would do for Vallecitos would, at that time, I think it's going to start in 1920? In fiscal year 1920 is when these payments would start either option. The amount then would be a leveled, I think it's like $1.44 million a year. When that levels off, and at the end of the 20 years, it's done.
And what is that number?
It's $1.4 million a year. So do you want to know that it's about $29 million over the life of the loan? And I have a chart showing the interest payments at the end.
So we'll be paying $12 million in interest.
Yes, and there's a chart at the end that'll show, so you don't have to write it all down right now. There's a chart that'll show all the interest numbers for every option that I'm going to go over right now.
Okay,
So I'll show that to you.
gotcha.
So what we want to do then is compare everything to since the 30 years off the table, I'm not going to show, I'll show it one more time, but we want to compare everything to the 20-year, and we'll call that the baseline. So every chart that I show you now is going to have this 20-year, it should be red on your screen, hopefully, the 20-year is the baseline. So PERS still then offers a 15-year, and as General Manager Perone explained, it's like a home mortgage. You can pay it off a little bit quicker. It's going to bump up your payments. So instead of the 1.4 million a year, it'd be about 1.65. It'd be about $250,000 a year more. So it's $250,000 more, but you're paying it off 5 years quicker. Okay, and then the other option is that if you, the disadvantage to that, and I don't really want to go into advantages and disadvantages really, because we haven't vetted all of this yet, but if you select the 15-year payment, I believe you're locked into that. So you can then say, okay, I want to you can't go out and like refinance and say, I want to go back to a 20-year. Once you tell PERS you're at 15, I believe you're locked into that 15. So another option then would be just to make an additional payment of your choosing per year. Now I just selected $1 million just to show you the difference. So instead of the baseline of the 1.4 million, you pay 2.4 million a year. And what that would do is then reduce your term from the 20 years down to 8. So you're paying it off in less than half the time by just adding $1 million per year to the payment schedule. Okay, so that's all the PERS funding options that we have. So then we looked at what are some of the other options we can do. Well, we can go do external funding, and Mr. Perone mentioned going out for debt. And again, the debt wouldn't necessarily be for the PERS portion of it, but it'd free up money then to pay down the PERS. So if we went out for an external debt, the interest rate now is about 3.7%. So what that would do is reduce your payments from the 1.4 million down to about 1.2. So it'd be a savings of about $260,000 a year. So that's an option that we could do, is look externally for it. The next option, which was listed as, that was 3A on the sheet that was shown earlier. The 3B was then do internal borrowing, borrow from your reserves, and set up a repayment plan. So again, using the 20-year PERS as your baseline, if we put in a 20-year internal borrowing, our internal rate of return right now, what we earn on our cash right now is about, it's going up a little bit. It's been about 1.6%, but we put in here a 1.8% estimate. So if we were to borrow money from ourselves at 1.8%, it would reduce that 20-year payment from the 1.4 million down to about a little over 900,000. So we're talking about $700,000 per year less. Again, that is funding from our reserves. Then we looked at different options. Instead of a 20-year repayment plan, what if we accelerated a little bit and put it as a 15-year? Again, as you shorten the years, your payment amount's going to go up a little bit. So on a 15-year, your payment would still be about 1.1 million, which is still about $250,000 less than the baseline. And I'm going to compare everything to the baseline. And then what I did just for kicks is I said, well, what if you made the same payment that you would pay to PERS? So you kept it at the 1.4 million borrowing from yourself. What would happen? What would happen is that the payment schedule would reduce to about 12 years. So by borrowing money from yourself, you're paying the debt back. Instead of 20 years, you're paying it back in 8 years. What I'm going to do is just review everything that we went through. Now I'm just going to throw everything in one slide, and it's going to be a mess, but I just wanted to kind of show you all the charts that I just did all on one screen, just for a visual. So the first one, I'm sorry, was the 30-year. This is the baseline 20-year from PERS. This is the baseline 15 years from PERS. I'm sorry, not baseline, that's the 15 years from PERS. And this is the one where if we threw in another $1 million on the PERS, so making it a $2.4 million payment. And I cannot read it. This is the external debt service over 20 years at about 3.7%. Then we have our internal borrowing, 20 years at about 1.8%. Internal borrowing, 15 years. And then the last one I just showed you on the other one is internal borrowing over 12 years. So what's important to see on this, as you pay more upfront, if you look at where that dips to zero, that's when your debt is paid off. So on the first one, and I don't know if I can show it with the mouse. I don't know if you guys can see with the mouse, probably not. Okay. On the first one, the debt would be paid off in about 2028, 2029. That's doing the additional $1 million per year. All the way through to our original, with a 30-year term, it was probably 2048.
And you have a chart coming up saying how much that is.
The next, so that would be this chart on the right, which I will expand in a second. So what's a summary of all that? I know I threw out a lot of charts for you. So what it is, again, the 30-year amortization option is no longer viable. However, I just wanted to show you under that debt repayment schedule, our total interest, not the principal, so add the principal amount to this if you want to know the total payment. It's, when you're comparing, I like to look at the interest charges on that because that's what it's actually costing you. So on the 30-year, it would cost us about $21 million in interest payments over the life of that 30 years.
You do that, so.
Over their baseline now 20-year schedule, the interest payment would be about $13.5 million. So if we choose if we don't elect, have any other options, that is the baseline, that is what we would follow. And then I went over the PERS. If you ramped it up to the 15-year, your total interest payments would be about $10 million. And in the far right column shows you the savings. Now that savings is off of the red line of the baseline. Like I said, I'm comparing everything to baseline. So the 15-year schedule would, over the life of the term, would save you about $3.6 million. If you just threw in another $1 million per year, the savings would be about $8 million. So you'd be only paying $5.5 million in interest. Then we talked about external debt. If you did the external debt, the interest would be about $8.3 million, saving you a little over $5 million. And then internal borrowing, the next three are the internal borrowing at either 20 years, 15 years, 12 years, and you'll see your savings for all of them is between $10 and $11.5 million. That's my numbers.
Yes. Thank you.
On the internal borrowing options, you've assumed a flat interest rate of 1.8%, but wouldn't that be variable?
We did, and it really depends on how do we want to set it up. It would make more sense in terms of scheduling payments to have it a fixed rate. Now, you could set it at saying that's 2%. What General Manager Perlman was doing, you probably take an average of what you think you're going to earn over that time period and charge that as the internal rate of return.
I don't know if it's coming up, but it seems to me I heard that this is well and good for the amount that we now know. But next year, that amount may change because of the deficit. If we don't hit the 7% discount rate, and we get their traditional 6%, that little bit that's, again, offset comes back to us anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yes, Director Martin.
Are we billed for PERS on an annual basis, or is it per payment period?
So the UAL, and Wes, help me if I get this wrong, we have the option of paying it monthly, but we can prepay that annual, the 12-month amount up front, so in July.
And we pay it up front because there's a savings realized by doing that.
So this year, 7%.
Yeah, so we ended up saving like $35,000 this year by paying the full $952 at the beginning of the year.
So we do pay it up front now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
And that's my last slide, I believe.
All right.
So now I'll turn it back to you, General Manager Perlman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So it's obvious, looking at this chart, that there's a lot better options than just working with PERS. So I think we can be creative. We can come up with ways that will reduce our PERS obligation, our total costs, and still allow us to operate the district as it needs to be operated. One of the things the board may remember, if you look in your monthly packet in the warrants list, there's a line item that says $200,000 for OPEB. So this year, we've been paying $200,000 per month to retire our OPEB obligation. So by June, we'll have fully retired all of our other post-employment benefit fund balance. It started out about $1.8 million, and I think we started this back in, I want to say, October maybe. So we're going to make 9 payments of $200,000, fully retire that. So when we bring up an idea of like, hey, let's throw an extra $1 million towards PERS, it's not crazy. We did it this year for OPEB. We put 1.8 million, so we could probably even do more than the 1 million, but that's just an option to look at. Okay, so we talked about, this is the cost of what it would take to retire that debt to PERS. And what we want to do is look at what would that mean to the customers. So based on what Mr. Gilpin was talking about and the limitations that we have, without going in through meet and confer and a negotiations process, what you're going to see right here is if all those costs were put onto the ratepayers. So that's what this is. Just to be clear, that's what this is showing. So we have two different types of ratepayers. We have water customers and we have wastewater customers. Some of our employees charge their time exclusively to wastewater, some exclusively to water. Most of us are to both. But we can't charge all of these costs to one or the other, because then we do have some customers that are only water or only wastewater, and it wouldn't be fair if we stuck them with it and the other customer who doesn't use that service says he gets a free ride. So what we did is we split these costs, these PERS costs, and it's just by coincidence that it's almost 50-50. So the last number I saw from a staffing level costs, about 51% of our costs are on the water side, 49% of the staffing costs are on the wastewater side. So we use that breakdown when we look at these numbers to put them on the customer basis that way. So that'll be a dollar amount on an annual basis on either the water or the wastewater side. So how do you spread that over your customer base? So for water customers, there's two kind of straightforward ways to do that. One is you can just say, hey, put it as a fixed charge on every meter. Larger meters may carry a larger share, but all meter classes, everyone with the same size meter would pay the same cost. Another way to do that is just to spread it over the units of water purchased. One of the things I find interesting about this PERS analysis is some of the numbers are so big. We're talking tens or hundreds of millions of dollars at times, but we also have a very large customer base. We have 22,000 accounts. There's 12 months in a year, so that's the $250,000 accounts and data points that Mike talks about often. But the units of water, we sell almost 6.5 million units of water every year. So if you start spreading these costs over a unit of water, it makes the cost per unit pretty small. On the wastewater side, we looked at spreading it on what we call an equivalent dwelling unit. So a single family residence is one EDU. If you have a large business, a large manufacturing place, they may be 100 EDUs. So if you just take the equivalent number of EDUs, so we have about 22,000 accounts, but I think the equivalent number of EDUs is 35, 40,000, somewhere in that range. We can get exact numbers for the board if you'd like. So that's how we're spreading these costs. First of all, we took the whole number, what it would cost to retire the PERS obligation. We split it into water and wastewater, and now we're trying to find ways to apportion it to our customers. So the numbers I'm going to give on the next slide are how it would impact a typical single-family customer. So this is a person with a 5/8 inch or 3/4 inch meter. They consume an average of 13 units of water per month, and they are connected to our wastewater system. Obviously, if you're a larger user, a bigger meter, or you're not on the wastewater system, your numbers may vary, but this is for a typical single-family customer. Just like what we do when we go to rate hearings, we always try to put it in the context of a single-family customer. So in the numbers I'm going to show you on the next slide are relatively short in duration. It's how much are the costs going to increase from what we're proposing in the budget, the 18-19 budget, which you just heard about yesterday, up until 2021. So that's only a 2-year time span. And the reason we're doing that is because over those 2 years, two very important things are happening. One is we're going to see the full realization of whatever option on the UAL that the board picks. Whether we stick with the 20-year that PERS is suggesting or do something else, that's going to ramp in probably either next year or the year after, but it'll be within that 2-year block. The other piece is that the normal cost, if you remember before, I showed that the district's normal cost percentage was ramping up to 15.2%. It maxes out at 15.2% in fiscal year 2021. So those two changes will have occurred by fiscal year 2021. The actual changes beyond that are very small. So the ta-da moment. So if we can go over this. So this is a chart similar to the one that Mike showed. If you look at the first column, it's a list of all the options. So 30-year amortization, 20-year, the 15-year, 20-year plus $1 million a year, external debt, internal debt, and internal borrowing 3 ways. The savings column is what Mike showed. It was the far right column on Mike's chart before. Now we've eliminated the annual payment and the total interest payments. But the three columns after that are what's important. And remember, see the footnote at the bottom. The monthly impacts that are shown here are comparing fiscal year 2021 projected to 18-19, so over a 2-year period. So, and I'll just pick one. I'll pick the PERS baseline. If we went with the PERS baseline, a typical, the monthly additional unfunded accrued liability portion to a single-family homeowner is going to raise their monthly bill by $1. A typical single-family homeowner is currently paying about $125 per month on their combined bill. So the $1 is very small in comparison. The normal cost, the other piece, the district share of that would increase it by 56 cents. So that single-family residential customer monthly bill 2 years from now would be $1.56 more than it will be in 18-19. And if you go through all the other alternatives, you can see variations on that theme. They're all a little bit different, but they all, I think they're all very manageable. You'll look at the third one down, the plus $1 million. It's the highest one, it's at $3.66, but it's also the shortest in duration. So remember, if you shorten the duration, you're going to kind of increase the pain for short periods of time. But for every one of these that you see on here, at the end of their term, so whether it's an 8-year, 12-year, 15 or 20-year payment, at the end of that, you're actually going to see a decrease in the customer's bill because you no longer have to pay that unfunded accrued liability payment. You won't lose the normal cost payment, but the unfunded accrued liability payment will fall off their bill. Now, to be clear, we're only talking about PERS. This is not any other cost that may increase over time. The purchase cost of imported water, electrical costs, chemical costs. Yes, those will be factored in, but I think we're demonstrating that we're doing everything we can to control those costs, and we're trying to show that we're doing everything we can to control this cost as well. So again, we're trying to put this into perspectives. I know sometimes the numbers are so big that it's intimidating, but when you start spreading them over time, over a large customer base, I think they're very manageable costs. So next steps, discuss the options. I'd like to hear from the board what options you may like, you may not like. Are there options that you think we should have looked at that we didn't? Before we leave here, I'd like to find out from the board which options do you want us to consider or us to continue looking into. We can go a little bit deeper on these and refine the numbers. There's a legal analysis that needs to be done on this too. So when I talk about spreading the costs over water customers based on units of water or meter size, there's a legal issue there that we need to talk about. I'm just trying to give a perspective for these numbers. We also would like to incorporate the latest actuarial report. It's not out yet. It's going to come out in between August and October. When that comes out, I really believe our UAL is going to go down. And we talked about this last Wednesday. As the market continues to rise, the UAL goes down. So it may be a good time to incorporate that new information. We'll then come back to the board based on the new actuarial report and whatever options you want us to look at with a refined analysis. And at that time, we'll hopefully receive the board direction, and then we'll implement whatever that direction is. It could be going out to issue debt. It could be entering into some arrangement with PERS to go from 15 years instead of 20 years. But ultimately, we'll come back and we'll take that information and incorporate it into the 19-20 budget. So the 18-19 budget is okay, the one that you saw yesterday, and we'll be approving hopefully on June 6th. But the budget after that is when you're really going to start to see the impacts here. And with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Before we start, I do have a public speaker. I'd like to get that off the chart. Mike Hunsaker, please.
Mike Hunsaker, 115 Equestrian Court, San Marcos. There is a hidden assumption that goes in most of what you've heard. You've heard some allusion to it in passing, but it doesn't consider inflation. There are three factors which are particularly contributory to inflation. One is lending costs, which are going up. Another is minimum wage. That goes through the entire society. Those are going up dramatically. And the third one is fuel costs because of transportations and importance. So inflation is set to rise dramatically. I've seen some projections going over 10% per year, back to the bad old days of the 70s. I've heard a number of workshops over the years, and one of the things that is mentioned as being a real time bomb but gets skipped over very rapidly is the purchasing power floor arrangement, where pensioners are guaranteed a certain percentage of their initial purchasing power, regardless of inflation. And we are supposed to make up the difference for that inflation factor. Now, how does that work? Well, that's a big, interesting question. Now, typically, there's different floor arrangements as to whether it's 75% or 85% of the retirees' pension benefit. And then once it gets above 75% or whatever floor it is, then we have to make up the difference. And if you start, everything's been sort of cruising along reasonably because we've had such low inflation, but that is going to change dramatically. And I think we need to have a discussion of just what and how this purchasing floor is calculated. Is purchasing power based on a national average? Is it a California average? Is it a San Diego County average? We have the worst of all inflation indexes to worry about. And if anyone has been going to the grocery store knows that the official figures are probably not too accurate. At some point, it'll have to catch up. So, what is the purchasing floor basis? How is it calculated? Thank you.
Okay, let's take some questions.
Okay, can we go back to the chart that shows the options?
Do you want this one or do you want the one?
That one, that one's perfect. And just looking at that, from a layman's perspective, the cheapest one going to our customers is the internal borrowing at 20 years. Reason being, number one, we're borrowing from ourselves, no prepayment penalty. Anytime we get one-time money, we can throw it in there. We have a lot of different options to do. My question, I think what staff is gonna say is, well, if we take 17 million and borrow from ourselves, Fitch is gonna have a fit. And my question is, well, doesn't Fitch realize that we're getting rid of a $17 million obligation? So really on a balance sheet, it should come out to be the same. I'm guessing, but I need Wes's answer to that, I guess.
Yeah, that's, Wes, you can come on up. So that's one of the things, I said, there's more work we need to do. That's one of the things we'd have to look at for those particular options for internal
So you have to
borrowing.
go and talk to Fitch, because Fitch is gonna be hitting this with all of the clients.
Yeah, if we were to do that, it would severely affect our days in cash, obviously, because we're gonna be paying out $50 million or $17 million. So our days in cash would take a huge hit. And then you'd look at the levels of reserves would be low. There's other issues that would affect us. So what we plan on doing is doing a pros and cons to any of the recommendations that the board has and bringing those back to you and saying, okay, here are the pros and cons to each of the options that you like, and we can kind of weigh it going from there.
Well,
Those are some of the cons to it, yes.
Okay, and I understand that. That's the only one that I could see was that, and that Fitch would have to take into account an obligation that you no longer have.
Yep.
You've paid it. As far as EWA, we have no control over that whatsoever. Our board member has to work, they have to agree on the 3.2 million, right? All 7 of you, or whatever it is?
Yeah.
So, nothing we can do with that, but the 17.2 just makes sense to keep it as low as possible and borrowing from ourselves in my business if I had to borrow money and I had a pot over here, I would borrow it from myself before I went outside and have limited options. Especially, I would not do business with PERS other than what I have to do, because they're not in it for us. But I have a feeling that PERS amount will go down, and we might be well-funded in the future. So my direction would be to go with the internal borrowing at 20 years and keep that payment. Boy, that 47 cents per SFR looks really good.
Well, I have a question, because I don't know why you would perceive that PERS is going down. They have never hit their mark on the discount rate. Oh, excuse me, on an overall time, a year or two ago, they had the 11%. But, you know, their average is about 6 and they're projecting 7. It befuddles me, because my concern is we go through this. The next time we get the actuarial, oops, you owe an extra $500, $1 million. Deal with that. And then again, and again, and again. I see no incentive on PERS part to make it go down. They're just cruising along.
I don't think it's their incentive. I think the market is gonna just make that happen.
Well,
That's what we're gonna
well,
see.
yeah, but
That's what we're gonna see in the next one, because the market has gone up so well. If that continues or stabilizes, this would fix itself in 5 or 10 years.
well, that's my concern, that because it has gone up these many years, if we went to our summit here the other day, I mean, we're in a 10 or 12-year progression, and usually they last 5 to 7. So we're heading for a real dip, which is going to then mean they're not gonna get to their 7, they're not gonna get to their 6. And what happens then if in years to come, they tell us that we need to come up with more money? That we just have to find more money to stay even?
Yeah, so my guess, and nobody knows, my guess is that even with this 20-year horizon that PERS has set, that they're gonna be checking in regularly and find out, are we heading in a good direction? If the market has a correction and enter into a prolonged bear market, they may extend that window out. They may say, hey, the agencies can't afford with a shrinking horizon, you know. So if they start a 20-year clock in 18, 19, so sometime in 38, 39 fiscal year, you have to be paid off. If the market's going along okay, and then halfway through you get a serious correction, agencies won't be able to make up that, whatever that correction is, in a short period of time. So my guess is that they would go back to the drawing board, but we don't know, and I don't think they know, other than that they'll check in annually and see how they're doing on their protections.
Okay.
But you're right, at the end of the day, if the number gets bigger, they're gonna say, we still need that amount from you, and then it's kind of a discussion about how do we get it to.
So another part of that too is we're part of a risk pool, so we have a certain percentage of that pool, and that's not gonna change. So if the value changes, we're gonna take that hit no matter what. The benefit to paying it off in advance is we won't be paying the 7% plus that hit. We'll just be taking that hit.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, I mean, we're making 1.8% on our money. You can pitch pennies against the wall and make that. At least this way, we would be making 7% on our money. And that makes absolutely good sense. Questions elsewhere? Yes, sir.
Hey, Glenn, on the OPEB $200,000 a month payment, or is that $200,000 a year?
No, it's 200,000 a month for 9 months in this this fiscal year.
And then that's gonna go away?
That goes
Right.
away, our OPEB will be retired.
Forever.
No, well, I think it's similar to PERS. So we'll be at 100% funded ratio, and then if there's a good market next year, we may be super funded. If there's a down market, we may be slightly under 100%. But my recommendation to the board, unless something catastrophic happens in the market, is that every year you'd make a correction to keep your OPEB fully funded, so that you don't let it get far afield like PERS has gotten.
Yeah.
Once you get it close, you want to keep it close.
Okay.
So when this goes away and, or is paid off in a few months, are our customers gonna get a discounted rate? Like you said, for, everything else, if we, after 20 years or 15 years or 20 years, whatever we end up going with, is is there gonna be a reduction because of that $200,000 a month, or?
Well, so the answer is no, because we're in the middle of the 2-year rate increase. So I can't remember when it's gonna be, but we're gonna come back to the board before January 1st of next calendar year to see if you want to take advantage of the full rate increase that was approved in the 2-year rate set. At that time, when we come back to the board, we'll take a look at the fiscal health. Part of it saying, hey, we don't no longer have to pay OPEB. That puts us to the upside, but there's maybe other things that bring us down, so.
Is this, okay, thank you. Which kind of concerns me that future boards, when we get down 12, 15, 20 years, are gonna have that same discussion. Do they give the money back to the ratepayers, or do they just use it for something else, or keep
Right.
it, or whatever? So, no guarantees that it goes back, because of, even with the OPEB. But, on this additional $1 million payment, is that monthly, or is that annually?
That's a annual payment that you could make monthly. You could do it 80,000.
And
whatever,
but the OPEB's
85,000.
200,000 a month.
It was yeah, so the OPEB was 1.8 million in fiscal year 17-18.
So, my first choice would be that we take the OPEB savings and we apply it directly to this plan of just additional lump, I think you called it a lump sum, or,
Yeah.
and then don't raise anything to the customers, just they're paying it as it anyways through OPEB. That's built into our rates currently. There's no increase to our customers. We're gonna drop an extra 1.8 million to our unfunded liability, and all is well. We get it paid off very quickly, and it's over with.
So, again, just maybe a little clarification, I don't believe the OPEB payment was a budgeted line item going into the year. We made that decision as we were going forward. We said, hey, we're selling a lot of water, economic conditions are good, it looks like we'll have a surplus, and we have this high debt, high interest rate debt. So let's divert money there to retire that debt and at least cut off one of the legs, get rid of OPEB. So we diverted it to there. That doesn't mean that it's, you have 1.8 million in surplus budget capacity to do that now for PERS, but we can certainly run the numbers. If that's an alternative the board would like us to look at, we can bump that $1 million surplus to.
We still have it in the budget, one way or the other, because we budgeted for, as of last night, we have $9 million that we're putting towards reserves. That's 1.8's in there because those rates are already established.
Right.
Because those rates aren't going down, we just talked about that. So, rather you say, I mean, it's in the budget, it's just, it's in the $9 million in reserves, so we just don't, we have, 6 point, or whatever, 7.2%,
Yeah.
or $1 million in reserves instead of 9.
Right.
So the way that was set up is when we did a 2-year rate increase 2 years ago, we budgeted for it in the first year, but not in the second year. So we budgeted to have those OPEB payments in 17-18, and that was considered as part of those rates. The 18-19 rates didn't include the OPEB payments because they were supposed to be, they were budgeted to be finished. So this 18-19 budget does not include.
So that revenue is not in there. And so then the rates don't reflect those.
These upcoming rates won't reflect it. They
Okay,
won't.
okay. So then,
But they do, the upcoming budget does reflect the 20-year payment, right?
Yes.
So the 20-year payment plan, it has enough money in the proposed budget for 18-19 to make that PERS UAL payment.
Well, and actually, the 20-year payment doesn't start until 1920. So the 18-19 budget doesn't even include the 20-year amortization. It's still set on the 30-year amortization. We'll be looking at the 20-year amortization in 1920. So in next year's budget, we'll be looking at the change that PERS just made. Because it doesn't go into effect until July 1 or June 30, 2019.
yeah, I'm really attracted to the lump sum option, because I think it rips the Band-Aid a little bit faster and gets us through this faster. The thing I want to find a way to do it without impacting our customers, because we do have strong reserves. We've put ourselves in a very healthy financial position as a district, both in our current reserves that we have, our reserve pool, plus the additional $9 million that's anticipated to go in there in this upcoming fiscal year. If we're talking about just $1 million a year, I thought it would be kind of neat if we could just take the OPEB and just move it over there and address it that way. But even if we can't, I'd still rather just put $8 million in reserves and not impact the customers. would be my first choice. If that's not something that the board is agreeable to, then I certainly think of those other options that you had up there. I agree with Director Martin that if we were gonna, do anything, I would borrow money. Again, because we are in such a sound financial position as a district, I would rather borrow the money from ourselves and pay ourselves back versus borrowing it from PERS at 7%. But I think that there's an opportunity to either do the $1 million lump sum or something around about that, with either splitting the cost with our customers and find some sort of solution where the customers pay some and we take out some out of our reserves, or we just take it out of our reserves altogether on a year-by-year basis. And the question I did have with that is, can we start doing that? Let's say we do that for the next couple of years, where we just take $1 million hit on our budget every year, however that impacts our reserve contribution. But then, say 3 or 4 years into it, we realize that the economy's changed, or there's another drought and we're not selling water as much, whatever it might be. Can we adjust it then at that time?
Yeah, I believe the answer is yes. I think what we do to commit to PERS is we say we want the 20-year plan, and we may make incremental payments, accelerated payments as funds are available. So we may do that 3 or 4 years. It'll lower our amount, our unfunded accrued liability. They'll recalculate how much our payment will be in the coming year. And then if we don't want to make an extra $1 million payment that year, we'll just pay the minimum amount that they recalculate. And that's, Mike touched on that. You may not want to go to a fixed 15-year, because once you say fixed 15-year, you're stuck on that.
Yeah.
It's like a home mortgage. It's best to go with a 30-year mortgage, but make extra payments.
What is our total reserve amount? 42?
60.
It's more than that. It's
How much?
It's around 61 or 60.
Oh, 61, well, that's
Is that
even
net
better.
of
All right. And just to be clear, so that can, portions of that, we have now hired an individual to, a group to to look for investments for us.
Yeah. Chandler Asset Management.
And how much of that reserve are we letting them look at to invest?
So what's happening is we're keeping our operating reserves in our operating, so we have that available, because we have to have 3 to 6 months of operations available to us. The rest is going to Chandler for investments. And currently, we're sending in $3 million a month until we get to that limit. So it'll be around $45 million that they'll be in.
So they're gonna be investing $45 million,
47.
some 47, of our 61, and then the differential,
Stays in lay for the county pool.
I'm sorry?
It stays in lay for the county pool. Currently, we have
Oh.
$5 million in the county pool, and we have the rest in lay.
In what?
Lay, the local agency investment fund.
And do we have an option with those? Can we put it in or not?
Put it in lay for or not?
Yes.
Typically, we keep it there because they're the highest earning investment pools that we can have and still keep our liquidity.
Ah.
Late you can get out same day, so it's available
I
same
see.
day, and they're earning
Mhm.
about 1.65 right now.
Yes, so Chandler may invest in something that has to be there tied up for 6 months or
Yeah.
so. So we wouldn't have that liquidity.
Okay. Other questions along the way? Yes.
Not really a question, but I'd be supportive of an internal borrowing. To me, it's really just, it's the cost of money, and so it's the cheapest cost of money of any of them is some kind of internal borrowing, but not knowing the risks and impacts to the credit rating, I would obviously need to know what those are. So.
Yeah.
I had a question on the OPEB. Now, you said that was to retire an unfunded liability.
Correct.
And so our normal costs going forward for OPEB, what is our liability going, it should be going down. I would think our OPEB is, I mean, we don't have that much going forward, I don't think,
Wes, do you know the answer to that?
to future retirees.
Yeah, so our liability will be zero because it will be fully funded. We'll have just the normal cost, which is the cost to existing employees that plan retirement. And the good news is we have no future employees coming into our OPEB. So
That's my point.
So
That's
that
our-
cost will actually be reducing as
Right.
people retire, if we keep hours may reflect a liability because it's based on the previous year, so it won't reflect our fully funding,
Yeah.
but in the future, it'll be zero.
So what's the normal annual cost going forward?
That's a good question, I'll have to get that about for you.
Okay. Thanks.
A couple of things. First of all, it was a great presentation. It's a lot of information, and I'm very comfortable feeling that we can get all the details, and you understand when you're presenting is that you've looked at all the details and the things that come up. Because there are lots of coincidental or repercussions of each of some of our options. And it was interesting as you were answering the other directors' comments on that. I agree, first of all, that I would not want us to lock into the 15-year. I think we need to keep our options open. So you asked for a con, that's mine, is like, please don't look at that one any further. I do believe the internal borrowing is the prudent, logical way to go, although I don't know for sure which of those in relationship to where the future's going and where we're at. But I also like the combination idea of an additional, did you call it supplement?
Yep.
So I understand why the 1.8 million is then not in the next budget, because you knew it would be no longer required. But I do understand we have ways of coming up with that money in the next budget, and I know reserves don't always just mean it's free money. We have reasons why we keep certain amounts and it's dedicated. But I would like to consider a way that we could also supplement it so we can shorten it as much as possible. And of course, we want to keep it as low as possible on our ratepayers. I know I'm not terribly fond of ripping the Band-Aid off. I know it's a way to go, but for me and the people I know, I think we'd rather be a little bit slower, but I'm not saying we shouldn't look at doing it. I'd like to see a way of maybe combining those two, so maybe there's a percentage of reserves or a percentage of the money we make as the OPEB goes down that we can, or whatever that amount is maybe, we can dedicate to pay down this. And then I did want to ask, this is where I don't know quite the answers, but I noticed that when Mike Hunsacker got up and he was talking about the inflations and possibilities of that, how does our staff in our financial department, when you're planning forward, I'm assuming, because you always have the answers, that you take a lot of that into consideration, but in moving forward with this, even just projecting ahead as you did, are you just moving it fully forward as if everything's the same, or are you also assuming, besides another world war, where we're headed?
Go ahead.
So that's difficult because most of this is done by PERS. So it's hard for us to guess what PERS is going to put into their assumptions. We do make our own assumptions internally for the budget, of course. We have our COLAs, we have our inflation rates, we look at historical, and we think is going to happen going forward. PERS kind of affects this. So, but the good news is, the good news necessarily, but on the 20-year amortization schedule, our payment should be 1.4. Now that could go up or down, and it's probably going to. They're going to say, okay, we didn't realize our returns, so they're going to change our payment. It might not be 1.4, it might be 1.5, and it should be 1.3. I believe they're going to keep us on a 20-year amortization schedule, but we're going to have to pay off our balance over that 20 years, so it could go like this. We're assuming flat, so it's kind of like an average, and that's the best information we have currently. So it's hard to forecast what will happen with PERS.
Right, okay. Well, then I feel very, that it's been thoroughly inspected, and I appreciate that.
I did not, the question was relative to this floor and increasing our portion if the inflation goes up. Is that something that we have to even consider?
No.
No, I didn't think so. Thank you.
So
Yes.
just to recap, I guess, the board direction, if I heard correctly, you guys are gonna take a long, hard look at the internal borrowing 20-year option, and then you're gonna look at the supplemental payment options and what maybe can be done there, and maybe present to the board at a future meeting a few different options, sub-options in that category. Everything from no impact to the customer to maybe a 30% of this to 50% of that to 100% of that, 366.
Yep. we can do that.
Yes.
And I'm guessing that the same as with the other ones that Glenn, you talked about, that one-time monies that come in and estimates on reserves, extra reserve money come in that keep us, we're still at medium, but there's extra, that all that would be going towards the internal borrowing of 20, because we can do that, it's our money, and would further reduce that amount possibly year by year,
Right.
depending on how well we do. I mean, this is worst-case scenario, as I'm looking at the 20-year, is 47 cents. But who knows what one-time money's gonna come in, and who knows, so that would be my direction.
Yeah, that was kind of the intent of that option 4, the kind of a hybrid. Just because you make a decision to do internal borrowing, that doesn't mean you couldn't make supplemental payments when the Diamond Environmental Services check comes in.
Right.
So, and just for additional information, our current reserve policy actually states that additional monies like this, reserves, will be marked for OPEB. So it states that currently we can actually, since we're gonna be fully funded in OPEB, we can change the wording of the reserve policy to state that it'll go to PERS instead of
Mhm.
OPEB.
Perfect. Wes, you're always one step ahead.
Hey,
Yes.
I've got a question on this chart. So for the 20-year, why does it actually go down on the unfunded? Yeah, Mike wants to.
The UAL, he was waiting.
Let me take that. I was actually
I knew it.
supposed to
I knew he wanted
explain
to
it earlier. Okay. So, I don't know if I alluded to it, but for the PERS 20, right there. Oops, let me go back one. So it's this orange line back on the bottom. Shoot, I need my glasses, all right. Okay, so with this option, the 20-year internal funding, what happens is the first year's payment is actually below what we're scheduled to pay in 18-19. 18-19's payment is 964,000, give or take, and the internal payment with these assumptions is probably like 950,000. So you have this little bunny slope, or like I like to say, my skiing prowess, little effect right there where it's going down for that first year and then it flattens out. And that's why you'll see that -9 cents. It's because we're comparing it to the previous year, so that funding will go down about $20,000 a year. Somewhere around there.
Thanks.
Further questions?
Just to make sure, and I'm sure I have it right, that this would mean if we borrowed it internally and paid off, and seeing as we're already July 1 paying PERS for whatever the billing amount is, that we don't owe them a penny to pay 7% on, correct? That's a huge savings,
Huge, yeah.
huge savings. Great, thank you.
Timeline for getting back to us on this information?
Well, we're not in a hurry right now, so I'm guessing it's gonna be a latter part of the year. We're probably gonna go do some more analyses. We're gonna bug PERS to try to get the actuarial report
Mhm.
out. We'll take that information, we'll refine all the numbers, and we'll come back to the board towards the latter part of the year. Maybe one more check-in before then, just to let you know if we get any updated information. But,
All right. And out of curiosity, could I ask the other board members, do you have any feeling for EWA? Has there even been a discussion down there?
You'd probably got a better feeling having talked to the other
Manager.
managers.
yeah, so I can tell you what I know. So originally, EWA had told us that they don't hold any of the debt. The debt belongs to the agency. So they were just gonna send us a bill, say, pay us $3.2 million.
Right.
They checked with their legal staff, and their legal said, no, you can keep it on the EWA books and work out a payment plan. They went out, the general manager and the assistant general manager went and met with all the member agencies, including Vallecitos, and they were trying to find out from us what kind of a payment plan would we like. And we said, well, at a minimum, probably over 3 to 5 years. One agency said they'd pay it up front. Another agency said, how about 10 to 20 years? But I think what they're hearing is they're probably looking at a 3 to 5 year payment for each agency to pay their share, our share being $3.2 million. So at the high end, if it was 5 years, that'd be about a $600,000 a year, a little over $600,000 a year payment to retire EWA
Will
person.
each agency have the right to do it Or they all have to do it the same way?
They have to do it the same way, so they're trying to find a middle ground. That's why they called it their listening tour, to go out and hear what every agency wanted to do. And then they were gonna get back with us and say, is everybody okay with this kind of middle of the road one? They haven't done that part yet. So they did the initial part, and they heard 6 different answers, and they haven't come back and said, here's what we are proposing to do.
So I think they're waiting for the next actuarial.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're waiting, yeah, that's what Mr. Steinleck told me, their general manager. He said when the new actuary report comes out, they'll refine the numbers, re-engage the agencies, and make a recommendation probably through the Policy and Finance Committee, and then ultimately to the EWA board, which will have to be approved by the member agencies.
And when does this unfunded mandate, when do we get a bill for that?
For the unfunded accrued liability, from
Or
EWA?
are
you
we
mean?
already paying 7%?
Are you talking for the EWA portion?
No.
Oh, for our portion? Every year, we're paying there's interest on the unfunded accrued liability, so.
Right now?
Yep, right now, and the payment that you're gonna see in the 18-19 budget, that'll be hopefully adopted on June 6th, we'll have a line item in there that shows a payment to PERS for UAL with there's interest included in that.
So actually it behooves us to do it sooner the better.
Sooner is always better when you're getting charged interest.
Right, compounded.
Yeah,
At 7%.
Thank you.
yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I found interesting, I'm gonna fast forward to this last slide, right here. If you look at the bottom 3, I guess I was looking at either the savings column or the total monthly column, and it's a trade-off. So the biggest savings you get is internal borrowing for 12 years, but it's the hardest hit to the customers.
Right.
So, but if you wanna lessen the impact on the customers to the third one from the bottom, 47 cents, you're gonna be paying, you're not gonna save as much in the long run.
Right.
Yeah.
1.2 million more.
Yeah, but I think we've got enough direction today, unless the
Okay.
board has any other comments.
Very good.
All right.
Because I think we paid it off in 12 years.
Yeah,
Oh.
with accelerated
Because of
payments.
other things that are
Yeah.
gonna happen.
Mhm. All right, if there's nothing further, we are adjourned.
All right, thank you.